There's a photograph that shouldn't exist. Taken in the winter of 1972, it shows two boys standing outside a police station in rural Pennsylvania. Their faces are blank, not scared, not relieved, just empty, like something had been carved out from the inside. The detective who took that photograph kept it in his desk drawer for 31 years. He never showed it to anyone. When he died in 2003, his daughter found it with a note paper-clipped to the back. It said only this: "They told the truth. That's what destroyed everything." For 53 years, the case of the Reeves Boys has remained one of the most disturbing mysteries in American criminal history, not because of what happened to them, but because of what they said happened. And because when they finally confessed, the entire investigation collapsed like a house built on rotten wood. This is that story. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Reeves family lived on the outskirts of Millerstown, Pennsylvania, a town so small it barely registered on state maps. Population: 417. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets festered in the spaces between Sunday services and Wednesday dinners, where darkness wore a familiar face and called you by your first name. In the autumn of 1971, two boys vanished from that town. Michael Reeves, age 12, Daniel Reeves, age 9. Brothers. They disappeared on a Thursday afternoon in late October while walking home from school along County Road 14, a 2-mile stretch of cracked asphalt that cut through dense Pennsylvania woodland. When they didn't arrive home by 4 o'clock, their mother, Dorothy Reeves, assumed they'd stopped at the Henderson farm to see the new calves. By 5 o'clock, she was worried. By 6, she was frantic. By 7, every able-bodied man in Millerstown was searching the woods with flashlights and hunting rifles. They found nothing, not a shoe, not a schoolbook, not a single thread of clothing. The boys had simply ceased to exist, as though the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. The local police called in the state investigators. The state investigators called in the FBI. For 3 months, Millerstown became the center of a media storm. Reporters descended like vultures. Television crews turned the small town into a spectacle. Dorothy Reeves appeared on the evening news, her face hollowed out by grief, begging whoever had taken her sons to bring them home. But as winter deepened and the snow began to fall, the searches became less frequent. The reporters left. The FBI packed up their equipment and moved on to other cases. The town settled back into its rhythms, though something had fundamentally changed. People locked their doors now. Children no longer walked home alone. And in church basements and corner booths at the diner, people whispered theories they were too afraid to say aloud. Some blamed drifters. Others spoke of a predator hiding in plain sight. A few, in hushed voices, mentioned the old Chamberlain property, abandoned since 1959, where local teenagers swore they'd heard screaming on moonless nights. The official investigation went cold, but the town's wounds stayed open, raw and infected. Then, on January 18, 1972, 91 days after their disappearance, the Reeves boys walked out of the woods. Not stumbled, not crawled, walked. A dairy farmer named Ernest Kowalski spotted them at dawn, moving single file along the tree line bordering his property, about 7 miles north of where they'd vanished. He later told investigators that what struck him wasn't that 2 missing children had suddenly appeared. It was the way they moved, methodical, synchronized, like soldiers on patrol. He called out to them. They didn't run toward him. They didn't react at all. They just kept walking, their eyes fixed straight ahead until they reached the county road. Then they stopped and waited. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, the boys were sitting side by side on the shoulder of the road, their hands folded in their laps. They were wearing the same clothes they'd disappeared in, though the fabric was rotted and torn, stained with things the officers didn't want to identify. Their hair had grown wild. Their fingernails were black crescents of dirt. But physically, medically, they appeared unharmed. No visible injuries, no signs of sexual assault, no evidence of starvation or dehydration. According to the preliminary medical examination, they were in remarkably good health, considering they'd been missing in the dead of winter for 3 months. The town erupted in celebration. Church bells rang. Dorothy Reeves collapsed in the hospital hallway when she saw her sons, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. The local newspaper ran a headline that read, "Miracle in Millerstown." The story was picked up nationally. For 48 hours, it was the feel-good story America desperately needed, a ray of light in an era darkened by Vietnam and Watergate, and a growing sense that something in the country had broken and couldn't be fixed. But the police knew better, because the boys weren't talking, not to their mother, not to the doctors, not to anyone. They sat in their hospital beds, side by side, staring at the wall with those same empty expressions Ernest Kowalski had seen. When Dorothy tried to embrace them, they tolerated it with the passive acceptance of mannequins being posed. When asked where they'd been, they said nothing. When shown photographs of local men suspects the police had quietly been monitoring, they showed no recognition, no fear, no response at all. The FBI agents who'd worked the case returned to Millerstown. Child psychologists were brought in from Philadelphia. The boys were separated, interviewed individually in rooms designed to feel safe and non-threatening. Still, nothing. Days passed. Then a week. The celebration curdled into confusion, then frustration, then something darker, because the longer the boys remained silent, the more people began to suspect that maybe they'd never been taken at all, maybe they'd run away, maybe this was all some elaborate hoax. The mood in Millerstown shifted, the miracle turned sour, and then, on February 3rd, 1972, 16 days after they'd emerged from the woods, Michael Reeves began to speak. What he said would unravel everything, not just the investigation, not just the town, but the very possibility of understanding what had happened in those woods. The interview was conducted by FBI Special Agent Howard Brennan, a veteran interrogator with 17 years of experience in crimes against children. He'd worked cases that would have broken lesser men. He'd sat across from monsters and never flinched. But according to his own notes, later sealed in federal archives until 2015, nothing had prepared him for Michael Reeves. The boy sat perfectly still in the interview room, his hands resting flat on the table. Agent Brennan began with simple questions. Are you hungry? Are you comfortable? Do you know where you are? Michael answered each one with a single word. No. Yes. Yes. His voice was flat, mechanical, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't understand. Brennan tried a different approach. He asked about school, about friends, about the things 12-year-old boys typically cared about. Michael responded, but there was no life in his words, no personality. It was like interviewing a recording. Then Brennan asked the question he'd been building toward. Michael, can you tell me where you were? Can you tell me who took you? The boy's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted, just slightly, to meet Brennan's gaze. And he said in that same hollow voice, we were never taken, we went willingly. Brennan paused the interview. He needed clarification. What did that mean, willingly? Where did they go? Michael's answer came without hesitation, without emotion, like he was reciting facts from a textbook. We went to the place beneath the Chamberlain house. We went because we were invited. We stayed because we wanted to learn. The Chamberlain house. For decades, it had been the subject of local legend, the kind of story teenagers told each other to prove their courage. It had been abandoned since 1959, when the last of the Chamberlain family, a reclusive old woman named Vera, had died alone in the house. No one had claimed the property. It had simply been left to rot, swallowed by the forest. Kids said it was haunted. They said if you went inside on certain nights, you could hear voices coming from below the floorboards. They said Vera Chamberlain had done things in that house, rituals, ceremonies that decent people didn't talk about. But those were just stories. Ghost tales, small-town folklore, weren't they? Brennan asked Michael to explain. What did he mean by the place beneath? What did he mean by invited? Who invited them? The boy tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to translate something complex into language Brennan might understand. Then he said, the shepherd. He lives beneath. He's been there longer than the house, longer than the town. He called to us, not with words, with feelings, with promises. He showed us things no one else could see. The interview transcript records a 7-second silence. Then Brennan asked the obvious question, what kind of things? Michael smiled. It was the first emotional expression he'd shown since being found, but it wasn't a child's smile. There was something ancient in it, something knowing and cruel. He showed us what people really are, the boy said. underneath the skin and the smiles and the church clothes. He showed us the truth that everyone tries to hide, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You don't want to. Agent Brennan made a decision that would later be questioned by every investigator who reviewed the case. He brought Daniel Reeves into the same room as his brother. Protocol dictated that witnesses, especially children, should be interviewed separately to prevent collusion or contamination of testimony. But Brennan wanted to see something. He wanted to see if the younger boy would corroborate his brother's story, or if this was some kind of psychological break, a trauma response that had caused Michael to retreat into fantasy. Daniel entered the room and sat beside Michael without being told to. The brothers didn't look at each other. They didn't speak. They simply sat, their postures identical, their hands placed in exactly the same position on the table. Brennan asked Daniel the same questions he'd asked Michael. The 9-year-old's answers were nearly word for word identical, same flat tone, same empty affect, same disturbing precision. When Brennan asked about the shepherd, Daniel's response added details that Michael hadn't mentioned. "He doesn't have a face like we do," the boy said. "He wears faces, different ones. Sometimes he wore my father's face. Sometimes he wore the pastor's face. That's how he got us to trust him at first, but underneath, there's nothing, just darkness that thinks, darkness that wants." The interview lasted 4 hours. What emerged was not a story of abduction and captivity, but something far more disturbing. According to both boys, they had encountered the shepherd on their walk home from school. He had appeared to them as someone familiar, someone safe, and he had offered them a choice. They could go home to their ordinary lives, their ordinary fears, their ordinary futures, or they could come with him and learn secrets that would make them special, powerful, free from the weaknesses that plagued normal people. They had chosen to follow him. Into the woods, to the Chamberlain house, and then beneath it, through a door in the basement that led down into tunnels the boys claimed ran for miles under Millerstown. Tunnels that had existed long before the town, before the settlers, before anyone had given this land a name. In those tunnels, the shepherd had taught them things, how to see in complete darkness, how to quiet their minds until they couldn't feel pain or fear or cold, how to understand the language that existed before human language, the sounds that animals made in the moments before death, and he had shown them the others. According to the boys, they weren't alone down there. There were other children, some recent, some very old, some who could still remember their names and where they'd come from. Others who had forgotten everything except the lessons the shepherd taught. The boys described them in clinical detail. A girl in a blue dress whose skin had gone translucent. A boy with no eyes who could still see better than anyone. Twins who had learned to share a single heartbeat between them. When Brennan asked why they had come back, why they had left the tunnels after 91 days, both boys gave the same answer. The shepherd said we were ready. He said we could go home now and show others the way. He said Millerstown had given him children for a very long time, and it was our turn to help him gather more. The interview ended there. Brennan shut off the recording equipment and sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the two boys who stared back at him with eyes that looked human but felt like something else entirely. Later, in his sealed report, he would write, "I do not believe these children are lying. I believe they are telling the truth as they understand it. That is what terrifies me." Within 24 hours of that interview, a tactical team was assembled. State police, FBI agents, and 2 trauma psychologists descended on the abandoned Chamberlain property. They brought ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging equipment, cadaver dogs, and enough lighting to turn night into day. The house itself was a rotting corpse of Victorian architecture, its windows like empty eye sockets, its porch sagging like a broken jaw. No one had lived there in 13 years. The front door hung open, swollen with moisture and time. The team entered at dawn. Inside, they found exactly what you'd expect from a house left to decay: collapsed ceilings, black mold spreading across walls like cancer, furniture decomposing into abstract shapes, raccoon nests and bird skeletons, and the smell of organic matter returning to the earth. They documented everything, photographed every room, and then they found the basement door. It was in the kitchen, hidden beneath a rug that had fused with the floorboards. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands that showed no rust despite the moisture. Strange, the team leader noted in his report that everything else in the house had succumbed to rot, but this door looked almost preserved. They opened it. Stone steps descended into absolute darkness. The air that rose from below was cold, far colder than it should have been, and it carried a smell that made two of the officers gag. Not decay, something else, something mineral and ancient, like opening a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. They went down, flashlights cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to resist the light. The basement was larger than the footprint of the house above it, carved directly into bedrock. And there, in the northeast corner, they found it. An opening in the stone wall. Not a crack or a natural formation. A deliberate passage, roughly 7 feet high and 4 feet wide, leading deeper into the earth. The walls of the passage showed tool marks, chisels, hammers. Human hands had made this. But when? And why? The team followed the passage. It sloped downward at a steady angle, twisting through the rock like a fossilized worm track. They found scratch marks on the walls, small handprints, a child's shoe, rotted beyond any possibility of identification. And then, approximately 200 feet from the entrance, the passage opened into a chamber. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. The chamber was roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow above the reach of their lights. The walls were covered in markings, not graffiti, not random scratches. Deliberate symbols carved deep into the stone, repeated in patterns that hurt to look at for too long, that seemed to shift and crawl at the edge of vision. In the center of the chamber was a depression in the floor, stained dark with substances the forensic team would later refuse to definitively identify. But there were no bodies, no bones, no evidence of the other children the Reeves boys had described. The cadaver dogs showed no interest in the chamber. The ground-penetrating radar detected no additional passages, no hidden rooms. The team searched for 6 hours, mapping every inch of the tunnel system. It ended in that one chamber, a dead end, literally and figuratively. The physical evidence told one story, the boys told another, and somewhere in the gap between those two narratives, the investigation fell apart. Forensic analysis of the chamber revealed that the carvings on the walls were old, very old. Preliminary dating suggested some of the markings could have been made as far back as the 1700s, possibly earlier. But there was no historical record of any structure on that land before the Chamberlain House was built in 1873. Local historians searched archives, property records, land surveys. Nothing. The indigenous tribes who had inhabited the region before European settlement had no oral traditions about the site. It was as if the chamber had simply existed in a blind spot of collective memory, known to no one and everyone at the same time. The stains in the floor depression tested positive for blood, human blood, multiple donors, but the DNA was so degraded that individual identification was impossible. The lab estimated the samples ranged from several months old to several decades old. That aligned, at least partially, with the boys' timeline, but it didn't prove anything. The Chamberlain House had been a known location for teenage trespassing for years. The blood could have come from kids cutting themselves on rusty nails, from occult dabblers playing at rituals they didn't understand, from anything. As for the other children the boys described, the translucent girl and the eyeless boy and the others, no trace of them was ever found. Missing persons reports going back 50 years were cross-referenced with the area. There were disappearances, yes. Rural Pennsylvania had its share of vanished children and unexplained absences, but nothing that formed a clear pattern, nothing that pointed definitively to the Chamberlain property or the tunnels beneath it. The psychological evaluations of Michael and Daniel Reeves were equally inconclusive. Both boys showed signs of trauma, but not the kind typically associated with abduction or abuse. No nightmares, no hypervigilance, no fear response to men who resembled potential abductors. Instead, they displayed what the psychologists termed affective flattening and dissociative detachment. They had retreated somewhere inside themselves, or something had been removed from them, leaving behind functional shells that could talk and walk and perform the basic mechanics of being human, but lacked the spark that made a person real. Dorothy Reeves took her sons home. The FBI closed the case file with a classification that satisfied no one. Insufficient evidence to determine the nature of the incident. The tunnel beneath the Chamberlain House was sealed with concrete. The property was purchased by the county and quietly bulldozed 6 months later. A parking lot stands there now, People use it every day without knowing what lies beneath their feet. But the damage was already done. Because the boy's confession had introduced something into the investigation that couldn't be removed. Doubt. Once they claimed they had gone willingly, once they described the shepherd not as a kidnapper but as a teacher they had chosen to follow, the narrative shifted. Were they victims, or were they accomplices? Had they been brainwashed, or had something darker already existed inside them that the shepherd had simply awakened? The questions had no good answers, and in the absence of answers, people filled the void with suspicion. The Reeves family was ostracized, quietly at first, then more openly. Dorothy lost her job at the library. The boys were withdrawn from school after other parents complained. Anonymous letters appeared in the mailbox, accusing the family of satanic practices, of corrupting the town's children, of things too vile to repeat. In 1974, 2 years after the boys returned, the Reeves family left Millerstown in the middle of the night. No forwarding address, no goodbye. They simply vanished, just as the boys had once vanished, but this time by choice. For 3 decades, the story of the Reeves Boys faded into the category of unsolved mysteries that people occasionally remembered and then forgot again. The kind of case that gets mentioned in true crime forums and late-night documentaries, always presented with the same inconclusive shrug. Strange, isn't it? Creepy, right? But ultimately unknowable. The world moved on. Then, in 2004, a private investigator named Caroline Webb began digging into the case. She'd grown up in a town 40 miles from Millerstown, and the story had haunted her since childhood. As an adult with resources and training, she decided to find out what had happened to the Reeves family after they disappeared from public record. It took her 18 months, but she found them, or rather, she found where they'd been. Dorothy Reeves had died in 1991 in a small town in Oregon, far from Pennsylvania, far from the memories. Cancer, according to the death certificate. But Webb tracked down the hospice nurse who'd cared for her in her final weeks. The nurse remembered Dorothy well, remembered how she'd asked, again and again, if her sons were in the room, even though they weren't. Even though, according to the nurse, they had never visited, not once. In her morphine dreams, Dorothy kept apologizing to someone who wasn't there, kept saying she should have known better, should have seen the signs earlier, should have stopped them before it was too late. Webb found Michael Reeves in 2005. He was 46 years old, living under a different name in rural Montana. He worked as a night security guard at a lumber mill, a job that required minimal human interaction. Webb approached him carefully, explained who she was and what she wanted. Michael agreed to meet with her exactly once. They sat in a diner at 2 in the morning, the only customers, under fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects. Webb asked him the questions everyone had wanted answered for 33 years. What really happened in those tunnels? Was the shepherd real? Were the other children real? Michael stared at his coffee for a long time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice still carried that same flat quality it had in 1972, as if some essential component of him had never returned from beneath the Chamberlain house. "You want me to tell you it was all trauma," he said. "Some kind of psychological break caused by a real abduction that we couldn't process, so we invented a story to make sense of it. That's what the doctors wanted to believe. That's what everyone wanted to believe, because the alternative is worse." Webb asked what the alternative was. Michael looked at her then, really looked at her, and she later wrote that his eyes were the most terrible thing she'd ever seen. Not because they were cruel or empty, but because they were awake, aware, and utterly resigned. "The alternative is that we told the truth," he said. "That there are places in this world where the rules we depend on don't apply, where things exist that are older than our ability to understand them, where something has been feeding on children for longer than America has had a name, and it's still down there, still waiting, still calling. The alternative is that Daniel and I heard that call, and we answered it, and we learned things that human beings aren't supposed to know. And now we have to live the rest of our lives pretending we didn't." Webb asked if he'd stayed in contact with his brother. Michael shook his head. "Daniel made a different choice than I did," he said. "I came back to the surface world and tried to forget. He went back." The investigator's notes recorded her next question, though Michael never answered it. She asked when. When did Daniel go back? Michael just stood up, left money on the table for the coffee, and walked out into the Montana darkness. Webb never saw him again. 3 months later, Michael Reeves was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was 46 years old with no history of cardiac problems. Caroline Webb tried to locate Daniel Reeves. She searched for another 2 years, following paper trails and dead ends and rumors. She never found him. But she did find something else. Between 1972 and 2007, there had been 9 disappearances of children in towns within a 100-mile radius of where Millerstown used to be. 9 children who vanished without a trace, without witnesses, without explanation. All of them were between the ages of 8 and 13. All of them disappeared while walking alone on rural roads in the late afternoon. And in each case, in the weeks before the disappearance, other children in the town reported seeing a man who looked familiar but wrong, someone who wore their father's face, or their teacher's face, or their pastor's face. But underneath, they said, underneath there was nothing but darkness that thinks. The parking lot that covers the old Chamberlain property is still there. During the day, it's just another piece of unremarkable infrastructure, a place where people leave their cars while they shop or work or go about their ordinary lives. But the maintenance workers who service that lot have reported strange things over the years. Cold spots that appear in summer, sections of pavement that crack and buckle for no structural reason. And sometimes, late at night when the lot is empty, they say you can hear sounds coming from below. Not voices exactly. Something older than voices. Something that might be calling, might be waiting, might be inviting the next child who's brave enough, or curious enough, or broken enough to listen. The Reeves boys were found in 1972. What they confessed destroyed the case, yes, but maybe that was the point. Maybe some truths are designed to destroy the investigations that uncover them. Maybe some doors, once opened, can never really be closed. And maybe, somewhere in the darkness beneath the everyday world, something is still teaching its lessons to students we've simply stopped looking for. If you made it this far, you're part of a very small group who knows this story now. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you dismiss it as folklore, as tragedy filtered through trauma and time? Or will you wonder, late at night when you hear unfamiliar sounds, if there are places in your own town where the ground goes deeper than the maps show, where something patient and hungry has been waiting longer than your family tree has roots? Thank you for watching. If this story affected you, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think really happened to the Reeves boys. And if you're walking alone on a rural road someday, and someone familiar calls your name from the tree line, remember this story. Remember that some invitations are designed to sound like rescue, like escape, like the answer to questions you didn't know you were asking. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay in the light.